Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well, as we're straddling health and commerce, the two faculties that we've come from, and the commerce faculty we're currently working in. Good morning, everyone, and thank you. This presentation comes from early phase research, so today is about opening dialogue rather than presenting conclusions. I'm presenting on behalf of my research team, and we work across both academic and practice spaces, which is why we sometimes describe ourselves as pracademics. Because we work in both program implementation and academic analysis, we see firsthand where people fall between systems, and this research tries to understand that gap. Much of what we learn in the field shapes the questions we interrogate academically, and vice versa. And today our presentation is titled Beyond the Medical Model, Rethinking Social Protection, Work, Rehabilitation and Rehabilitation for Persons with Disabilities in South Africa. I might forget about the clicking. Why social protection? Just to situate our study, the historical context of social protection. To understand why we focus on this topic, we need to return briefly to 1994, just briefly. South Africa inherited a social protection architecture designed to provide income security to protect people with disabilities from poverty, with the emphasis of protection, and stabilize households during a transition to democracy. At the time, linking the disability grant to inability to work was meant to shield individuals from a highly unregulated labour market. It was never intended to exclude people from future economic participations. However, as pathways into work have expanded, for example, through public employment programs like the EPWP, the Extended Public Work Program, being one of them as an example, the logic of the disability grant has not evolved at the same pace. We present this history not as a problem but as context that now requires re-examination. In terms of reform, much has changed administratively over the past 3 decades. Thresholds have shifted, systems have improved, and institutions like SASSA were created. But the core logic of the grant, centered on incapacity, has not been fundamentally reconceptualized. Today, the disability grant remains tied to a medical assessment of inability to work rather than to participate or be included, or capacities-oriented view of human development. In parallel, recent policy debates, including those linked to the SDGs, have revived interest in the idea of social protection, not only as a poverty prevention, but also as a foundation for social and economic participation across the life course. Yet, despite this evolving vision, the disability grant still sits within a 1994 framework that prioritizes incapacity over capability. And this is where we need to rethink, and our discussion begins. How our research shifted toward public employment programs. Our interest in this research area emerged during our consultancy work during 2023-2024, when we were collaborating with the International Labour Organization. Through this work, we engaged with the EPWP, a public employment program that was based in Limpopo. The ILO and the Department of Public Works had conducted a scoping study developing a framework to enhance the participation of persons with disability in public employment programs. Their work highlighted several important elements. The need for participants or partnerships with OPDs and recruitment agencies, the clarification that disability grant recipients can participate in public employment programs without losing their grant, and the removal of administrative and attitudinal barriers. Improve cross-departmental collaboration and positioning public employment programs as possible transitional pathways into livelihoods. So public employment programs, just as a definition, is not designed to be employment. It is designed to be 80% of a living, well, not living wage, excuse me, a minimum wage. So it's a wonderful transitional tool to get people into employment and get people experience in the employment market. Because public employment programs offer short-term part-time opportunities and pay below the minimum wage, participation does not affect the disability grant eligibility. The alignment between social protection and public employment systems really caught our attention as it opened up spaces to explore how people navigate between these systems, and were contradictions that we saw. We were specifically focusing on the informal labour market and persons with disabilities' position in the labour market for that specific research, and this is how we came across what we saw as an anomaly, a story that stood out to us, a story that we're not familiar with. And the ILO and the Department of Public Works framework, it's known as the FEPPD, a very long acronym, but it's built on these ideas by strengthening OPD, Organizations of Persons with Disabilities Partnership, and addressing administrative and attitudinal obstacles, clarifying the disability grants participation rules, and placing greater emphasis on the public employment as a transitional livelihood pathway. Sort of working within the systems that are there, but making sure they work for everybody. For us, this represented a rare policy moment where two systems, social protection and public employment, were intentionally brought into conversation, and that provided a compelling entry point for reimagining the disability grant itself. So the methodology and scope for our research. Our presentation today focused on two components of our early phase work, which was our rapid literature review and policy review, and then our first two questions. Our study looks specifically at persons with disabilities who want to engage in the labour market, while recognizing that this is only one segment of the broader disability community. So at this stage, our work is guided by two questions. How do persons with disabilities navigate receiving the disability grant while engaging in a public employment program? And how is disability inclusion operationalized within public employment programs, particularly in relation to retaining social protection during employment? We hope that these questions will help us better understand the lived experience of moving between grant status and employment opportunities. Our research rationale centers on what we call the participation paradox. The paradox emerges from two truths. First, people with disabilities want to work. Work contributes to well-being, identity, social belonging, health, dignity, and a range of other positive outcomes. Secondly, the disability grant is still framed around incapacity. This creates fear and uncertainty, fear of losing the grant, misinformation at community level, inconsistent communication from officials, administrative ambiguity in the process of getting the disability grant, and stereotypes such as if you work, you must be healthy, which erases the need for reasonable accommodation, which in itself is a complicated conversation. As a result, although policies encourages inclusion, the underlying system logic continues to reinforce exclusion. This is the paradox at the heart of our research. And insights from the Department of Public Works and ILO study also shared. The scoping view study, using the EPWP as an example of public employment programs, found that even though the disability grant recipients can participate without losing their grant, participation remains low, and key reasons include inconsistent messaging among officials, stigma within communities, lack of reasonable accommodation, and confusion among implementers, and limited involvement of OPDs in program planning. In other words, a system designed to protect ends up inadvertently restricting participation because it still operates on a medical model rather than a capabilities model. In this paradox, this paradox invites us to ask, what would social protection look like if it were designed not only to protect, but to enable? Building on that question, our research begins to explore what might happen if we reimagine social protection not merely as a safety net, but as part of a much broader rehabilitation continuum. First, South Africa's disability grant was designed at a particular moment in history to provide protection, and it did so powerfully. But today, that same design is contributing to the paradox we just described. Secondly, we are beginning to explore how 3 decades later social protection might also enable participation, inclusion and well-being, both in the formal and informal labour markets. And thirdly, I'm not presenting answers today, but rather opening a space to imagine what could be possible if we rethink the disability grant within this broader rehabilitation continuum. Second last slide. On this slide, we begin to explore a possible new vision, a shift from thinking about social protection as a passive safety net to considering how it might also act as an enabler of transition into work. Our research asks what becomes possible if we understand social protection as part of a broader rehabilitation continuum. And in this sense, rehabilitation is not only the clinical, it is also social, economic, and structural. For persons with disabilities, access to work itself plays a rehabilitative role. It can strengthen confidence, social belonging, mobility, well-being, and ultimately pathways to sustainable livelihoods. Seen through these lenses, public employment programs might have the potential to function as rehabilitative stepping stones, particularly if the disability grant were interpreted through a capabilities perspective rather than one centered on incapacity. For such a transition to take shape, a few areas may need reflection. The disability grant's eligibility might need to place greater emphasis on capability and opportunity. Communication across departments could become more consistent. OPDs might play a more meaningful role in program design. Reasonable accommodation could need to be consistently supported, and participation could be understood not as something that threatens eligibility for the disability grant, but as a natural part of a broader rehabilitation and livelihood continuum. If these conditions were developed further, the disability grant could be understood not only as a mechanism for poverty prevention, but also as a tool that enables participation and opens up possibilities for transitioning into the labour market. With that in mind, I'd like to close by offering 3 questions that we believe are important to carry forward this discussion. If our social protection system was designed in 1994 to protect people, what might it look like today if we were redesigning it to enable people? Can a grant created to prevent poverty also become a tool that facilitates participation and well-being, functioning as part of a broader rehabilitation continuum? And how do we evolve a system built around incapacity into one that recognizes capability and supports the disability-related costs required for equitable access to livelihoods and employment? We are not presenting answers today, rather we are opening a space for collective imagination with policymakers, scholars, practitioners and OPDs to rethink how social protection can align with real opportunities for participation. Thank you very much, and we look forward to continue the conversation.